This week at Starbase, Booster 15's construction winds down ahead of its upcoming test campaign, construction of Ship 35 continues in Mega Bay 2, and crews stay busy at the launch site building out the infrastructure needed to support 2 launch pads. Now let's dig into this week's update. Demolition of the concrete wall around Starbase continued on Friday as work progresses to reconfigure the launch complex to support 2 launch pads. Additional racks of high-pressure gas storage cylinders were installed at the launch site. These cylinders are for the new launch pad's deluge system. The booster load spreader was picked up by the Mega Bay 1 bridge crane, while the booster test and transport stand was brought in. Marking a big step forward in launch pad assembly, construction began on the Chopstick support stand and assembly jig hardware. These structures will support the tower's arms and carriage components while the system is assembled. With initial assembly work wrapping up on Booster 15, the booster thrust simulator and transport stand was brought into Mega Bay 1. Booster 15 was then lifted off its work stand and loaded onto the transport stand ahead of its trip to the Massey outpost. Booster 15 emerged from the bay in the evening, pulling out into the ring yard, turning around and entering Highway 4 for the journey to Massey's. Demolition of the wall continued on Saturday. With the south side broken down, excavators with hydraulic breakers began working on the north wall. The crossbeam for the Chopstick support and assembly jig was rigged up and repositioned at the launch site. Another layer of columns and rigging would be installed before the crossbeam was ready to go. Workers made use of a telehandler to add and reposition a few more lengths of fencing ahead of the demolition. The empty ship static fire stand was brought out of the build site and headed up Highway 4 to join Booster 15 at the Massey outpost. A crew with a welder or plasma cutter was at work beneath the level of Tower 1's ship quick disconnect arm. Sunday saw the demolition of the wall near the D1 gate guard shack. The shack itself was demolished as well, with excavators moving quickly to clean up the debris. A hot stage adapter was brought out of Star Factory and taken to the staging area outside of Mega Bay 1. A work stand platform was also brought out and staged in front of Mega Bay 2. Back at the launch site, the second set of support columns were added for the Chopstick assembly jig. Meanwhile, the bridge crane inside Mega Bay 2 picked up the new work platform for installation. With the column pieces in place now, guy wires were set up in tension to keep them steady. Caps were also added to the tops of the columns to evenly spread the load and to hold and fix the crossbeam in place. This was followed by the installation of the crossbeam on the top of the columns. Once the Chopstick-specific support fixtures are in place, workers can begin assembling the Chopsticks. A concrete pump truck arrived in the evening, joining another truck that was already on site. The first pump on site set up around the large foundation pad near the commodities trench and D2 gate, where it began placing concrete. The second truck began setting up next to the first around midnight into Monday morning. At the build site, the hot stage adapter was brought inside Mega Bay 1 for installation on Booster 15. A plastic-wrapped Starship aft flap was delivered to the build site and staged outside of Mega Bay 2. After 10 hours of continuous placement, the first truck wrapped up its pour and began to pack up for departure. The second truck wrapped up its work about an hour later, heading out of the launch site with large areas left to fill in. The flap that was delivered to the build site was unloaded from the truck and taken into Star Factory. Crews worked over the poured areas, screeding and floating the concrete to create a smoothly finished surface. 2 SPMT units drove into the build site's main gate and headed through the yard between the bays on their way to the rocket garden. Since all of the remaining space inside the forms was in easy reach of a cement truck's discharge chute, the pour resumed. The work was finished in just over an hour, with the cement masons keeping up with the placement of the concrete. Back up Highway 4, a second Starship aft flap wrapped in plastic was delivered to the build site. The flat outer edges indicate that the flap doesn't have its protective heat shield tiles yet. Several concrete embed plates were also delivered to the launch site. These steel plates are installed with the studs embedded in the concrete, while the flat steel provides a surface for welding. Workers brought the booster pressurization pipe installation jig into Mega Bay 1 to end the day. Workers resumed after Christmas on Thursday with the Block 2 ship lifter brought out of Sanchez and taken into Mega Bay 2, where it was hooked up to the overhead crane. The empty support stand was sent back to Sanchez. The installation jig for Starship's Starlink satellite PEZ dispenser system was also brought into Mega Bay 2. Starship 35's nose and payload section moved through the glass-walled halls of Star Factory and headed outside, where it was staged outside of Mega Bay 2. As always, a lot of equipment was moved around at Starbase. 2 different ring stands were moved to new locations, while a Block 2 ship lifter was centered over the middle work stand in Mega Bay 2. This week at the Cape, Booster 1090 was offloaded from Just Read the Instructions to make its first visit to the docks. Booster 1085 wrapped up its own stay at the docks a few hours later and was laid flat for the return to Roberts Road, freeing up the dockside stand for Booster 1090. Cygnet Warhorse 3 towed Just Read the Instructions back out to sea a few hours later, ready to support the Starlink Group 12-2 mission. Doug joined Just Read the Instructions in support of the Starlink mission on Saturday, heading out to sea in the morning. Support ship Megan returned to port with the CRS-31 cargo Dragon following its 41-day stay at the International Space Station. Falcon 9 Booster 1080 was rolled out to Launch Complex 39A on Sunday, then slowly raised upright about 13 hours before liftoff. The Starlink Group 12-2 mission lifted off early on Monday morning, carrying 21 Starlink satellites into orbit. There was a small fire at the launch pad after liftoff, which set off the launch pad's fire alarms. The fire at the launch pad was left to burn for a few hours, with the flames eventually dying down as they ran out of fuel for the fire. SpaceX's support ship Bob returned to Port Canaveral with both fairing halves from the O3B mPower 7 and 8 launch. With the Astranus launch scrubbed, Cygnet Warhorse 1 brought a short fall of gravitas back to port empty-handed. Falcon 9 Booster 1090 finished its stay at the docks and was laid down on a transporter for its first post-flight refurbishment at Roberts Road. Dragon support ship Shannon departed Port Canaveral in the evening, making its way to the port of Long Beach in California. Shannon isn't expected to arrive until the 30th of January. Doug returned to Port Canaveral on Tuesday with both fairing halves from the Starlink Group 12-2 mission. Cygnet Warhorse 3 returned to port on Christmas morning, towing home Just Read the Instructions and Booster 1080 after its 14th successful mission. On Thursday morning, Blue Origin's own dockside crane removed a new Glen leg section simulator from their landing ship Jacqueline. Booster 1080 was offloaded from Just Read the Instructions and set down on the dockside stand for stowage. Making use of Bob's onboard crane, the 2 fairing halves, starting with serial number 202, were offloaded from Doug. Fairing half number 165 was unloaded next. Cygnet Warhorse 1 towed a short fall of gravitas to sea, preparing to support the second launch attempt for the Astranus From One to Many mission. A couple of hours later, Doug headed out to sea to join a short fall of gravitas in support of that same mission. And there you have it, another SpaceX and Starbase weekly update brought to you by LabPadre. I hope everyone has a safe and happy new year, and we'll see you in 2025. LabPadre out.